this will be the last thing we talk about concerning the Kennedy administration prior to his assassination. And unfortunately for President Kennedy, he didn't live enough to make a huge impact on civil rights. Now the man that will follow him to the presidency, Lyndon Johnson, made a tremendous impact on civil rights, which was kind of unusual because he was a Southerner, and at this time Southerners were not real interested in civil rights for Negroes. But Kennedy does give us a good start. So the overall topic will be the presidency of John F. Kennedy, Part 3, Civil Rights. And the first subtopic then will be Civil Rights Movement in America. And we're going to kind of explain how this whole thing that we know as the Civil Rights Movement even started. It was way before Kennedy's presidency. Obviously, it was a troublesome topic for his administration. It was something he had to deal with. And I'll just give you a preface to that by saying that President Eisenhower was a good president. Former general, served 2 terms. But as far as civil rights went, he kind of stood pat. He didn't do anything for it or anything against it. He just kind of ignored the issue because he knew it was controversial. And that's something that Kennedy gained from in the election with Nixon, because Nixon was a part of the Eisenhower administration. So it was a troublesome topic for Kennedy when he took over as president. But civil rights actually began back in 1954. Way before Kennedy was elected. And what happened in 1954 is the United States Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. So in 1954, the United States Supreme Court declared that segregation, or the separation of students in public schools, was unconstitutional. And that happened only because someone made an issue of it, sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court decision became known in American history as Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. I'm thinking some of you might be familiar with that. Okay? So that Supreme Court decision that declared that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional is called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And this event, this decision by the Supreme Court, began what we know as the long fight in American history as the Civil Rights Movement. This is when the Civil Rights Movement began, was with this Supreme Court decision in 1954 entitled Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, in which segregation in public schools was ruled unconstitutional. You can imagine the scenario. A student by the name of Brown sued because they were not allowed to go to a school that was white. Okay? Now, I got to tell you a little story because my wife told me this, and she's a graduate here, and she went to elementary school here, and she said the old Hispanic elementary school was down there, which is now the Highway Department building that's kind of across from True Value in that area by Schlumberger. She said that was an elementary school one time, and the only kids that were in that school were Hispanic kids. They wouldn't let the Hispanic kids come to East Side or South Side. Okay, they really were discriminating even in Worland back in the day when my wife went to elementary school, which would have been the 60s. Okay, and she talks about that being and she didn't mean that, this is just the comment, it was the Mexican school at that time. That's where all the Hispanic kids went. It's just kind of interesting. And, we have boundaries now where schools, these elementary schools we have in Worland, you have to go to the school by where you live. Now, you could petition, and some people have done that, to have their kids in other schools, but that's generally how it's done. West Side is a school that, not being critical, but being factual, that a lot of lower income people live around West Side. So that school is considered maybe more of a, they're more free and reduced lunch kids at that school than any other school in the district, and a lot of Hispanic kids go to that school because that's where they live in that area. Okay, now there's obviously some non-Hispanic students there as well. It's not segregated, but it's just kind of interesting how you do things. You can even go to the fact where we have classes in which we put maybe the lower achievers in. Now this is a higher achiever class. You mean, so in a way, if you don't have a certain GPA, you can't get in here. So I don't know if that's discrimination, but you always have some boundaries and you have to be able to decide what the difference is. But this Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas basically stated that you could not segregate schools and tell kids they couldn't go there because of their race. Okay? Now another incident occurred on December 1st of 1955 that really contributed to the civil rights movement and gave one individual his stardom to be the face of the movement. And that happened on December 1st, 1955, and it involved a lady by the name of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks. So on December 1st, 1955, an incident occurred in Montgomery, Alabama, involving Rosa Parks. December 1st, 1955, an incident in Montgomery, Alabama, involving a lady by the name of Parks. What happened is Rosa Parks was a 42-year-old black seamstress, and she was coming home from work, and at that time, on a bus, if you were a black person sitting on a bus, man or woman, and a white person came in, you were supposed to, by law, get up and let the white person have your seat. And she was tired, and she was not in a very good mood, and so what she did that day is she refused to give up her bus seat to a white man. And she was arrested because it was a law stating you had to do that. So under the laws of segregation, which were legal in Alabama at the time, Rosa Parks is arrested, charged, and fined $14 for not giving her seat up to that white man on the bus. So on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old black seamstress, refused to give up her bus seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And under local laws of segregation, Rosa Parks was arrested, charged, and fined $14. Now, at this time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was serving as a local pastor in Montgomery. He had no title, he had no entitlement, he had no notoriety. He was simply a pastor at that point at a local church in Montgomery. So at the present time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was serving as a local pastor in Montgomery. And he did not think that was right, and so he began what might have been known as his first protest, peaceful protest. And what he did is he led black citizens of Montgomery on a bus boycott. Okay? He led black citizens in Montgomery on a bus boycott. So as a protest to Parks' treatment, Dr. King, local pastor in Montgomery, led black citizens of Montgomery on a bus boycott. Now that means that the black people boycotted taking the buses. And it kind of spilled over to the point that I want you to know in the civil rights movement, there were white people that didn't support the discrimination on blacks either. And so people began to boycott the buses, and they did so for almost 13 months. Over a year, they boycotted these buses. Well, this whole thing goes to the United States Supreme Court as well. And on December 13th, 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled that all of Alabama's state and local policies on segregation are also unconstitutional. Okay? So on December 13th, 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Alabama's state and local policies concerning segregation were unconstitutional. In other words, they could not segregate in any way, shape, or form, schools, buses, or anything against blacks.
December what?
December 13th, 1956. Well, 7 days later, on December 20th, Dr. King proudly takes a ride on a bus in Montgomery because they end their boycott, and he sits in the front of the bus, which had been previously reserved for whites only. Okay? So, on December 20th, 1955, 7 days after that Supreme Court decision that ruled Alabama state and local policies on segregation as unconstitutional, Dr. King takes a ride on a bus in Montgomery after the boycott is over, sits in the front of the bus, which had been previously reserved for whites only. And it would have a sign on it, say whites only.
What day was this on?
That was 7 days later on December 20th. Now, this is where Martin Luther King Jr. gets his notoriety that lifts him to become the speaker, main focus, main advocate for the civil rights movement in America. This bus boycott in Montgomery is what really puts him on the national stage. But this is where civil rights comes from the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which disallowed the segregation of schools, and this bus boycott, which led to the Supreme Court ruling that all of Alabama's segregational laws were unconstitutional. Okay? Now that'll take us to something we refer to as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws. Anybody know what they are?
Yes.
What are they, Brianna?
They were pretty much the segregation laws that were put in place.
Hey, can you give me an example? We just talked about one.
Yeah.
One example of Jim Crow laws were black people forced to sit either at the back of the bus or stand when a seat came available for a white person. What we just talked about, what happened to Rosa Parks, which led to that, is a Jim Crow law. Okay? It's a law that discriminates, as Brianna said, against black people. So one example of Jim Crow laws are black people either being forced to sit at the back of the bus or stand up from their seat and allow a white person to have that when one comes available.
And you're noticing the 13
Thank you. We'll get to that in a minute. Another example is public establishments such as hotels and restaurants that banned Negroes. Hotels and restaurants that banned Negroes. Now, I'll tell you the Vince Lombardi story. How many people know who Vince Lombardi is? Famous coach of the Green Bay Packers. The trophy's named after him. Super Bowl trophy. One time, one of the struggles that they had in the 1960s in professional sports was trying to find a restaurant or a motel that would allow black people to even be there, even stay there. And so that was part of the responsibility of a coach in those days, is find a hotel or restaurant that would feed his black players. Okay? Now, one time Vince Lombardi walked into a restaurant weary late at night after a game, and he said, "Do you serve blacks here?" And the response, which was just brutal, of the owner was, "Yes, we serve blacks here. How would you like them cooked?" That's the response he got. Okay? Another example was, I don't know if you've ever heard of Ernie Davis, but he played at Syracuse University. He came after Jim Brown, a famous running back for the Cleveland Browns. And they played Texas for the national championship, and Ernie Davis won the Player of the Game award after they beat Texas, which was a huge upset in the national championship. And he couldn't go to the country club to accept his award as the most valuable player in the game because it was banning blacks from even coming. So he couldn't even go to his own awards assembly and pick up his award. So those are Jim Crow laws, okay? We got some examples here, and these are great examples. These are very hard to get. Here's a perfect example of a Jim Crow law. Drinking fountain, white, colored. This one came from, in July 14th of 1931 in Montgomery, Alabama. I found this in a secondhand store in Virginia City, Nevada, when we were there. But these are examples of things that hung over the top of drinking fountains. White and colored. Incredible. You can take a look at it. I have another one here. Where did I put it? Anybody see it? It's black. Right. Am I looking right at it? Oh, geez, look right at it. Now this one came September of 1932 from Atlanta, Georgia. And I didn't retouch either one of these because they're more if they're not. Colored entrance only. And we don't know. Do we even know what that would feel like? I got a little taste of this when I went to New York City about 10 years ago. I was on the Teachers Retirement Board in Montana, and we went to an investment conference in New York City because we had to figure out where we're going to put this retirement money to get the best money for our best bang for our buck. Well, it's hotter than hell in New York. How many people in New York City? Okay, so I have shorts on, a collared shirt, and they're having this dinner at this hotel in New York, and I walk in with this, what I thought was a pretty nice collared shirt and shorts, and they kicked me out because I wasn't dressed appropriately. And I'm thinking back to these people, not the same, but I'm thinking that really was awkward. And I'm not making this up. I had a long ways to go back to my hotel to change, and the meeting was in a back meeting room. So the person in the conference, honest to God, had me walk around the back of the hotel and had someone let me in the back door so I could sneak into that conference room and get under the table as quick as I could and sit down so they didn't notice I had shorts on. And I'm thinking to myself, this is what kind of what these people faced all the time. So Jim Crow laws were black people forced to sit in the back of buses or stand where a seat became available for a white person, public establishments such as hotels and restaurants banning Negroes, and Negroes were forced by law to use separate restrooms, drinking fountains, entrances, etc. Okay, so those are examples of Jim Crow laws that Dr. King and his group are going to fight. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, we'll talk about Dr. King, his civil rights organization, and his mission. This is kind of an interesting subtopic. So Dr. King, his civil rights organization, and his mission. Because what is he by trade? Pastor. Okay, he's a pastor. Okay, in 1957, Dr. Martin Luther King decided that he would form an organization that would be the name, so to speak, for his civil rights movement. And the name of the organization was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So in 1957, Dr. Martin Luther King organizes the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, better known as what? SCLC. That's what we'll use from this point on. But in 1957, Martin Luther King put that group together, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC, and it was based in Atlanta, Georgia. And some of the first men that joined with him in this SCLC were Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shutterworth, and Bayard Rustin. Those were three of the first men that joined with King and became a part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. Actually, there's a picture up here right here of Ralph Abernathy, signed picture, standing in front of the SCLC headquarters in Atlanta, right here. Okay, so Dr. Martin Luther King in 1957 creates the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's a civil rights organization that's based in Atlanta, Georgia. And some of the people that joined with him were Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shutterworth, and Bayard Rustin. There are others, but those are some first notables. Now, you've got to remember that Dr. King and the SCLC planned peaceful demonstrations. They were nonviolent. And he planned many throughout the 60s for two reasons. What two reasons was he planning these nonviolent protests? What was he trying to end? What was he trying to end? Two things. He was trying to end segregation across the United States, and also to end what? The big D word. Discrimination across the United States. So Dr. King and the SCLC planned many peaceful demonstrations throughout the 1960s for two main reasons. One, to end segregation across the United States, and two, to end discrimination across the United States. Now, I'm not going to give you a religious sermon, but I'm going to tell you about one that King gave in 1957. This was one of his first and most famous sermons. And he gave it at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Okay? So one of his most famous sermons he gave was in 1957 at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. So in 1957, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave one of his first and most important famous sermons as a preacher or pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. What's he have a doctorate in? Theology. Very good. We'll talk about that. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Actually, it was a church that his father was a pastor of, and he followed his father to that church. We'll talk about that later. Anybody want to guess what the name of his sermon was? Love your enemies. Thank you. Love your enemies. That's kind of an interesting topic. I thought maybe it would pertain to the principalship at times when I was doing that. Love your enemies. Obviously, Dr. King's going to find some enemies in the civil rights movement, is he not? Yeah, there's a lot of people that aren't going to particularly care for his actions and what he's doing. And you'll hear many examples of that during the course of this year when we talk about civil rights. And King believed that the only way to deal with your enemies was to love them, even though they're your enemies. So, in his sermon, Love Your Enemies, he stated that the only way to deal with your enemies, and he had a lot of them, was to love them. And in this sermon on this day, King stressed 3 steps on how you could love your enemies. He gave you a 3-step process of how to love your enemies. Because that would be somewhat difficult, wouldn't it, to love someone you don't particularly care for? So he gave us a 3-step approach to love your enemies. The first one I like because I used it a ton I still do in my life a little bit. Number 1, look at yourself and ask yourself a question. Why do I have enemies? Okay, you got to look at yourself and ask yourself the question, why do I have enemies? Look at yourself and ask yourself the question, why do I have enemies? Now this is kind of how I use this. It's a little different, but Lou Holtz, famous football coach at Notre Dame in South Carolina, now broadcaster on college football. I listened to him speak one time, it was awesome, in a coach's clinic, and he talked about criticism. And he said, when somebody criticizes you, look first at the person doing the criticizing. If that person is someone you respect, listen to the criticism. And he gave another way to deal with it. But if that person that's criticizing you, you have no respect for, no regard for, just ignore what they're saying. Don't pay attention to it. Because you don't have enough regard for them to think it's worthwhile. And I try to tell kids that if you're getting criticized for something, look at the person criticizing you. If that person doesn't mean a hill of beans to you, you don't have any respect for the person, then ignore it. Let it go away. Now, if you're being criticized,